Hey, this is Jack, and this live stream is called The Hidden Opportunity of Our Time. If you're here in real time, thanks for being here. If you're watching it after the event, thank you also for taking the time to be here. And I wanted to put this together today because there's some stuff that I've been chewing on over the last decade in some ways, several years, perhaps more intensively, since I came to the DC area. And it has to do with our ability to understand people who think and feel differently than us. And I think there's an intersection here between whether you're relating with people in your professional life, in your personal life, in your intimate life, or indeed how we relate to each other in our civic lives that I think is worth talking about. So I'm just going to be sharing some stuff right off the bat here that I've kind of found in my own life. I'm not saying I'm right about this. I'm saying, hey, here's what I've found. Take it or leave it. Try it on for size. Because the benefit that I've found is that I think I have a little bit of an easier time being okay in the world. And we are in times where it seems that that is increasingly hard for us to have. You know, call that what you want. Call it equanimity. Call it peace of mind. Call it acceptance, call it loving people who don't think the same things as you. And so this is coming up across the board for people, right? Whether it's difficult conversations in Thanksgiving, whether it's people in your family that you've been estranged from, whether it's a sense that the country or the world is kind of tearing itself apart and we just don't get each other and there's increasing polarization and perhaps you feel hopeless or helpless, powerless, kind of almost like a victim, right? Like this is kind of happening to you and you don't see any better ways forward. I don't know all the better ways forward. I have some ideas and I want to be in that conversation with you. If you're here live or even after the event, stick your name in the chat. Let me know who you are, where you're tuning in from. I will be here to take some questions as they come up. I will get to them in the order that they are given. So if you have something that you want to share, or ask, stick it in the chat, and I look forward to being in dialogue with you about it. I'll just say one quick thing about that. That is the spirit really that I'm bringing to this, right? So the reason I say I'm not right about this stuff is I'm bringing a spirit of appreciative inquiry, of open-mindedness, of let's find better ways forward together. So if you ask a question or if anyone even comes on here live later, I'm going to be in a spirit of dialogue with you, right? Where we're both trying to do our best to hear each other, relax judgments, get into someone else's world. And by the way, I've heard people say just how powerful this is in civic spaces, that there are very few places that people feel heard or that it's okay just to have their view or to have their experience. So the power of active listening is real. You know, I know that from my experience as a coach. I know that from when I feel listened to or not. And it's probably over a year ago, I held a super small event. It was an in-person thing. You know, I think there were literally like 5 of us. And the idea was to create a space where people could just talk about what shaped their political views, what significant emotional events happened for them politically, what sort of their political memory. And people got a lot more from it than I thought. I thought I probably had to put more content into it, and actually just having a space where people felt like it's okay to share who I am and what I'm about, where I've come from. They said that was really rare. So maybe you're having that experience today. If you're here listening and there's something in your life that is up, like you have an issue with your coworker, your partner, your sibling, someone else in the family, and you're willing to share, I would love to hear about that, because I want to see if we can get you some support and if there's any better ways of proceeding. So here's my mini pitch, kind of off the bat. Again, thank you for being here. Say hi in the comments. Let me know where you're tuning in from. My mini pitch is that your life will be better the more acceptance that you have of what is and what other people are. So the more you're able to say that people have a right to their views and their beliefs and their feelings and their lived experience, the more, by the way, you'll also offer that to yourself. The more you do that for other people, generally, the more you'll like yourself in your interactions with them. So it's kind of there's a self-serving angle here, if you will. There's also an altruistic angle. Most people like feeling understood and heard and seen. But the more you're able to do that for other people, the more you will like yourself, and the more ease and acceptance you'll have in yourself in your interactions with other people. So I just think that's a better way to be in the world. It can also increase your leadership, right? Even if you're not in a professional leadership capacity, right? We all lead our lives. We all influence other people. We all have other people that take cues from us, look to us, model from us, whether we know it or not. I've sometimes been amazed at ways that I have impacted people that I haven't even known. And they've said it years on, oh yeah, you just making that one comment decision makes a difference. So all of this stuff can add up. If you're having the experience that about half the people in the world are crazy or dumb or stupid or don't care, that is a difficult place for you to walk in the world from, right? Now you might say, well, but is it true? I'm here to say that the more that you expand your ability to understand other people's worldviews and the values that go into those worldviews, the less you're going to have the experience that people are dumb and that they don't care. What you might have more of the experience of is that what they are caring about might be different than you. And the moral foundations, right? So there's a little bit of geeky stuff here. Moral foundations theory, Jonathan Haidt's work and others. It's this idea that people have different kinds of moral taste buds. And basically, where you might have a sweet tooth, someone else might have a preference for salty. And so they're parsing reality for a different set of what is moral, what is valuable, what is worth paying attention to than you might be. And by the way, the same thing happens in intimate relationships, right? So you might have had an experience where it's been really difficult to relate to someone, or you just kind of keep missing each other. Maybe you're dating right now and you're having a recurrent experience. I don't feel seen or heard, or I kind of keep meeting these people. Maybe a woman that dates men and you're meeting men, you're thinking, they just don't get me, or I don't get them, right? We know, particularly generationally, the views of, let's say, young men and young women are moving further apart. So we have got some cultural and relational divides to bridge here. There's a world that deals with this. It's called bridge building, variously. Bridging the divide, crossing the divide. Sometimes that spills a little bit into things like community mediation, but it's basically getting other people's worlds, right? When I lived in Boulder for all the years I lived there, there was a big community of practice called authentic relating. And one of the ideas within authentic relating was, how do you get curious enough to really be in contact with someone else's world and care more about connection than about being right? And my simple Jack belief right now and perspective is that we would do well in our political lives to care more about being in connection than about being right. Because when, and I'll just own this personally, when I'm concerned with being right, I tend to tighten up. I tend to get rigid. I tend to get superior. I tend to miss the nuance in what someone else might be saying. I tend to not really be available to actually connect with the other person. So Ruby said, seems to be true in my experience. Yeah, I'm curious if there's anything specific about what has been true in your experience. Thanks for commenting. If you're joining us right now, we are talking about your way of being in the world. You know, I've been an integral ontological coach for well over a decade. The essence of that is to talk about what's your way of being. I'm noticing that our way of being, and whether that's in dating or all the way through to our civic lives, I think we've got some ways that we're being invited to grow, to give us more ease and acceptance in connecting with people that have a different reality, a different worldview. One of the presuppositions, right? Because as a coach, I'm often trying to listen. What are the presuppositions? What are the preconceived ideas that this person has about who they are, who the other is, and what life is? These are almost the sea that we swim in that we don't typically easily see. So what are some of the presuppositions that we might be bringing to our interactions with other people? One of the presuppositions that I've been trying on that I think can be helpful is to say people have a right to their lived experience. We all have different lived experiences. So just acknowledging that someone's worldview, thoughts, feelings are likely to be different than yours just because you've had lived experience that is different. Right? There's a certain way that your lived experience is completely unique. My lived experience is completely unique. So if someone has a right to their lived experience, they may also have a right to be in the perspective that they're in. That doesn't mean that that perspective is true or fully true. It doesn't mean that you have to agree with it. But there's a kind of sort of imperialism, if you will, that happens when I start to think, well, hang on a minute, you don't have a right to your lived experience. You don't have a right to think, feel based on what your lived experience is. And you don't have a right to be in that perspective because that perspective is wrong, it's limited, it's false, it's partially wrong, it's fully wrong. And that's the moment that, in a way, you could say you start to get a bit over there and encroaching on someone else's sovereignty. Now, you might feel incredibly passionate about the set of ideas and perspectives that you have. And in the marketplace of ideas, I think you have a right to pitch and say, hey, I notice you think this. I think something else. Can I share it with you? But if you want to be in the game of building relationships and connection and ultimately even influence with other people, it's probably easier if you start from having more than less rapport, right? And typically we have more rapport with people that we understand and they're having the experience called I feel understood. So it's sort of like a different jumping off point than, wow, you shouldn't think that, right? You can't think that. You don't have a right to think that. So we kind of get out of the should business. And normally, again, I can just own this. Anytime I'm in the should business, I'm shoulding on you. You shouldn't think, feel that. I probably am running that same racket on myself. Right? So it's probably something that I'm not willing to admit that I do actually feel, and I feel like I shouldn't feel it, right? Or I do actually have this perspective, but maybe I shouldn't have this perspective. So I try to keep it simple and just say, start where people are. People have a right to their lived experience. They have a right to their perspective. And so step one is, can I be in rapport with it? Even if it brings up stuff for me that's incredibly uncomfortable, like maybe I feel disgusted or frustrated or angry or disappointed or hurt, even just hearing something. But at least now I'm in contact with my authentic experience and I'm leaving them space for their experience. And in nearly any kind of relating, that is probably going to go better for you. I'm curious what you think. Let me know if you're picking up what I'm putting down. Let me know if you have a similar and or different experience. If you're just joining us, thank you for being here. Or if you're watching after the event, we are talking about ways of relating with people who think and feel differently than us, right? Which, by the way, is everyone. But in some instances, it's going to be more obvious and more gross than in others. Robbie, hello. Thanks for being here. Let me know where you're tuning in from. Carrie, hello. Back to you. Thanks for saying hello and welcome if you're just joining us. If you've got a question or a perspective that you want to share, hit me up in the comments. I read them all. I'll get to them. I haven't been live for a while, so this is probably going to be a smaller live here, but I am intending to be doing this much more regularly in this cycle and season. So thanks for being part of the inaugural one as I kind of dust off the cobwebs of not having done this for a bit. So here's one of the places that this can go, right? If we just want to put it into a civic context for the moment, is you might have an easier time to understand people that think very different things from you politically. One of the ways you might do that is by looking at this thing we call moral foundations, which again can sound a bit academic, but it's basically the idea that people have different moral taste buds. So the thing that you taste easily is not something that someone else necessarily tastes easily. So to give you an example, you might be very sensitive to questions of equality and fairness and social justice. For you, that's something you're sensitive to. It's easily tasteable. It's obvious to you, right? Just like if I eat ice cream, it's obvious to me that it's sweet. Some people eat ice cream and it might be obvious to them it's sweet, but they don't like it and they don't want it. It's too much for them. Similarly, someone else might have a moral foundation that really values authority and obedience to authority, or loyalty to the group, to the family, to the tribe, to the kin, to the nation. And that is the first thing for them that represents morality. So when you hear people talking about other people being, treasonous or sort of guilty of not being loyal to the group in whatever way that might be phrased, it might be because their dominant moral foundation is actually about loyalty to the group and obedience to authority, and is not about equality or social justice. So it's kind of giving people the opportunity to be valued a little bit more on their terms rather than on your terms. I studied social and political sciences at Cambridge, which is mostly politics and psychology. And one of the books that we had to read was a book that you may have heard of, is by Francis Fukuyama. I think it was written in maybe like 1989 or early 90s. And it was basically about the end of history. And the idea was that democracy, sort of liberal democracy and capitalism, have kind of won out. We kind of won the Cold War, and this is the end of history. Basically, it's sort of like a done deal. And of course, that wasn't actually right. And, from my perspective and studying development, we are open-ended systems individually and collectively, sort of meaning I'm going to imagine that there are many levels of development above my own, right? I think I've been through some levels of development in my life, and I continue to practice and care about it and learn and get feedback. But I'm going to have enough humility to imagine there are people right now walking in the world who have levels of development above my own. And in the same way that, for instance, I play chess, it's very hard if you're a certain ranking in chess, it's hard to know how much better than you someone else is, because you almost don't have the distinctions of, if I can play at a 1500, what is the difference between someone that plays at a 2000 versus a 2200? I probably don't even know the strategies, the tactics, the things to look for on the board. Similarly, with development, it's very hard to see developmentally upstream. It's actually hard to recognize if people are operating in a worldview, not that's better than yours, but might be in an ultimate sort of direction of evolution, right? Generally, it seems that people's worldviews evolve through time, individually and collectively. That's kind of a premise of developmental theory. And if that's true, it invites a little bit of humility. So I'm telling you about Francis Fukuyama because he was widely seen to be wrong. It wasn't the end of history. We've actually had the rise of things like authoritarianism. We've had the rise of this sort of communistic capitalist hybrid in China. We've actually had a lot of pushback against democracy. There's also a lot of questions about, is capitalism really all it's cracked up to be? Maybe there's a post-capitalist world that is increasingly coming and we want to be part of. So basically, I'm inviting you to imagine that whatever your worldview is now and whatever your core values are, they may not be the end of history, right? Meaning you may not be actually at the top of the developmental pole, able to sort of declare to everyone else, you need to get into my world because I know that this is the best game in town. You, 1, 3, 5, 10 years from now, might have a worldview that you have moved into where you get a bit more perspective on the worldview that you're in now and say, oh, actually, I can see that wasn't the only or biggest game in town. And even if it doesn't happen for you individually, you might just stay with that curiosity and humility that none of us really is the authority on our own and other people's development. Sure, some of us work in it or have ideas about it, or some of you have been in long-term therapy or coaching and that's changed you and improved you. But sort of the notion that you definitively can say, I know I'm more evolved than this person, and therefore sort of I'm good and they're bad, or I'm better and they're worse. I'm just inviting you to notice if that's a nice place for you to stand, and if it actually starts to limit the truth that you can metabolize and the values that you can metabolize. Said differently, I think, and this is my experience, try it on or let me know what your experience is. The more we learn to value more values, sort of the better we are in our lives, because we can sort of be with more things, have less resistance and less judgment of more things. And I think that means deeper acceptance, deeper love. I think that's generally a good way to go. So if there's someone you really don't get, it might be because you can't yet value the things that they value, right? It might be that you value freedom and they value security. It might be that you value equality and they value sameness. It might be that you value empathy and they value in-group loyalty. So you're thinking about empathy in this kind of universal embrace, which is in its own way kind of beautiful, right? We should have empathy for everyone. But their view is really my empathy is most appropriate for my family, my country people, my community. That's really where my attention goes first, and everything else is very secondary to that. Whereas for you, it might be like, well, I try to love and have empathy with everyone. Now, if you are someone that's very empathetic, you can also get curious, who is not worthy of your empathy? Because normally there are certain people or groups that kind of get left out. So it might be, I have lots of empathy for everyone, but gosh, if you don't love dogs, I'm going to struggle to have empathy for you, right? Or lots of empathy for everyone, but if you work in banking or pharmaceuticals or big tech or big pharma, big tell me what, yeah, that I struggle to have empathy for those people, right? Or if you're law enforcement or military, or you fill in the blanks, that there might be some people who are sort of left out of your system. And it's kind of one of the built-in ironies of this great project of the last many decades to include more people, to center more people's experiences. The whole drive really behind DEI, and what was good about that, in my view, was saying everyone's valuable and everyone's perspective matters and everyone should have kind of access to opportunities. I think that's a pretty cool thing. I think it's a good place for us to stand. And yeah, when we learn how to value more people's perspectives, it enriches our experience. However, I'm not going to demand that someone has to be in that perspective, right? So if my love for people is like, well, as long as you're on board with the way that I see things, I can have a lot of empathy for you. But if you have a different way of seeing the world, you start to limit my empathy. That's a good place for you to practice, not just for them, because of course, all of us tend to like it when people are more accepting and loving of us. It's a good place to practice for yourself, because it's growing you, right? It's easy to love on a cute dog, right? It's harder to love on the dog that's, been mangled, that's been, living in the streets, or it's harder to love on another species that doesn't elicit the oxytocin from you. So these edges are hard and also good for us. That's sort of my basic stake in the ground today, that your love, your leadership, your presence in the world is better the more that you can imagine other people are worthy of your understanding. But to do that, you might have to understand them within a worldview and a value system that isn't the one that you predominantly occupy. That takes practice, and it takes getting curious about what people actually value, because we're not even, most of us, particularly good, I'll include myself here, at sometimes naming what we actually value. There are just things that we use to navigate life. So for instance, in the Enneagram, we talk a lot about the 3 instincts: the self-preservation instinct, the sexual instinct, the social instinct. And these are kind of hardwired drives that for most of us remain unexamined. Someone who's high in self-pres is always naturally thinking about their base of operations, feeling secure, comfort in the world, resources. How am I managing my resources? And for some people, that's just not really a predominant set of questions for them. So when they're thinking about what's good for the community, or what kind of experiences they want to have in their life, they're not really thinking about comfort or security or maintaining foundation or having enough time, energy, and money to get through the month. Normally, learning how to value that stuff is generative. It's easier when people naturally align around these things. So I'm not trying to get too meta on you, because this stuff is also, it's pretty practical in terms of how to relate to people better. But it sometimes comes with understanding there are these sort of different vectors of awareness and sensitivity that each of us has. And as an orchestra of all of us, that works pretty well, because it means, you're kind of optimistic, I might be a little bit cautious, right? Or some of the risks that you don't see, I'm paying attention to them. But maybe where I sort of don't think, oh, actually picking you up from the airport, that might take 3 hours, you're kind of sober and aware of the reality of how long that takes. We can learn to do a similar thing in our civic lives, of noticing what is it that people actually are valuing, and do people, if they have a right to their lived experience, do they have a right to their fear, right? So I hear a lot of people in the sort of, love, not fear. And I get that, right? Of course, if we've got an option on our menu and it's love and fear, and we can find love, that's generally going to be better for you and for the people receiving it. But if I'm in a lived experience already called fear, love might not be available to me. And it's not going to help me to have you tell me I should be more loving. It's going to probably help me if you can be empathetic to the fact that I'm afraid, and meet me in that experience, and perhaps get curious about it and sort of hear me out, even if some of the things I have to say are a bit messy and unprocessed, and maybe even a bit ugly in certain ways. But I guess I'm inviting us to be sober, that if someone's in fear, you can have a paradigm that says, well, you should be in love and should all over them. But whether that soberly delivers them to where the place that you think is better, I'm not sure I see any evidence for that. I think generally, again, I'll just own it for myself. If I'm afraid, I do much better with people slowing down, tracking me, telling me I'm okay, that I'm allowed to be afraid, hearing my experience, seeing if they can help, kind of being a good friend and companion, putting an arm around me. Maybe you're the same. So let me know if you've got any questions. I'm curious if this is making sense. Again, I'm not attached to being right about this. I do sort of think there's some things bubbling up in me that I've wanted to share, because I'm worried, or I, like a lot of you, I have concern about where, I live in the United States, where this country's going. I've been back recently for a stint in the UK, where the UK is going, but sort of almost you could say, let's say the West at large, that we've got some big, and I'm sure beyond the West, but I'm just, saying maybe the places that I know better and have lived. And obviously there's lots of the West that I have not lived in, but I'm fairly well traveled in the West. we got some stuff to figure out. And my intuition is that the figuring out isn't going to come top down. My intuition is that the figuring out is going to come bottom up and peer to peer, that actually we have to take some kind of ownership of the kind of society that we want to live in. And it's not going to come, the politicians aren't going to solve it. The business leaders aren't going to solve it. Their participation might absolutely be necessary, but there's a way that I think society is changing that is inviting us to claim collectively more of what we want. You know, if you've seen me talk before, a lot of my work as a coach is about helping people claim their authenticity, claim their, or reclaim their power, claim their boundaries, claim their expression, sort of claim themselves, claim their authentic self more fully, that it's okay to be who you are, that it's sometimes difficult to be who you are, that you have a right to express who you are and to notice the places that you can and can't do that. And through coaching, the kind of work that I do, I can help people often express more fully the self that wants to come forward, not the self that's a set of learned strategies to adapt to the difficulties that we've all faced in one way or another, just being a child and being an adult. I think we need to do a sort of a similar thing collectively and sort of say, oh, actually, if it weren't up to the politicians, if it were more up to us to say, what kind of community do we want to live in? What quality of presence and listening and awareness do we want to bring to one another? What kind of open-mindedness do we want to bring to people who think differently than us? What kind of containers do we need to be in together? Because this commenting at each other online doesn't seem to be a way to resolve differences. It seems to sort of simplify and aggravate. What do we need to do as a community to get in the room together and to have difficult conversations and to be in relationship across difference, but to say, actually, there's probably some common ground here, and you probably have a right to your lived experience and your perspective. Where can I go to have that kind of conversation? Now, I'm totally up for being one of the people that can help create some of those spaces. Maybe I can co-create them with some of you. I think it's going to need a lot of us to sort of change the fabric of expectation, that we don't get just to be sort of armchair politicians, right? Where I sort of sit back and wax lyrical and tell you what I think about, various world leaders or politicians who've fallen short of my expectations, right? And the risk there is I'm slightly disowning my own experience and power, and I'm likely to be projecting upon political leaders some of my own weaknesses and fallacies. And I might also have some partial truths in there. I might be somewhat accurate or objective about this politician's strengths or weaknesses. But I'm sort of saying, if we stop looking to them as they've got to have this super high standard of sort of behavior and that they're going to really solve the major issues of our lives, then maybe there's a way that we can feel more responsible, but also creative and generative when it comes to creating some of the collective culture and solutions that we need for our time. We've got some big issues, right? You don't need me to tell you about the issues we have, whether it's, climate, migration, AI, all the things that people are worrying about. We've got levels of, teen anxiety through the roofs. We've got, young men and women really struggling. We've got epidemics of loneliness and diseases of despair. Suicide is one of the leading causes of death amongst young people. I mean, we've got some problems, right? And for a lot of us, it's like, yeah, but where do I even start with that? And I'm sort of saying, in a very simple way, being more in relationship with the people around you or who are part of your community of geography or care and practice, I think that is a big thing that you can do. Because it's not about one of us sort of having like, here's the brilliant idea solution. I think some of the best solutions are going to come from our way of being together around them. Almost like if we could get the people in your community together and say, hey, can we have a high quality conversation? We're not going to agree on everything, but where we're really trying to create a solution for this thing in our community, right? We know that childcare is too expensive for the vast majority of families. We need to find a way to get that cost down or to deal with childcare and support families, or even encourage people to have families. How can we come together around that? And a lot of this is happening. Actually, saying I've been in the UK recently, there's a real movement there at the moment to create these civic assemblies, which is really a community structure to say, let's have high quality facilitated small group conversations where no one dominates, where we have high quality of listening, where people feel invited, and where we get to explore not just our differences, but also where can we find common ground and where can we perhaps create a policy recommendation or a social project or some kind of action that is meaningful. And the evidence seems to suggest that when you can do that, people like it. There's really good data on this stuff. I'm actually excited. I'm going to be going to observe the Boulder Citizens Assembly next week. And this is a community conversation about their sort of vision for Boulder Valley, their land use, sort of almost the master plan really that the community orients around. And historically, that's been put together by elected officials and sort of the great and the good that inform them. And this is a little bit of a shift to say, well, actually, let's get ordinary people, normal people from all walks of life more involved and connected to what's their vision for their community. So this is also about distributing power and influence. It's about consequential voice. It's about doing things in a bit of a different way. So let me know if any of that's making sense. I'm not trying to preach at you. I'm trying to invite you in really to say, hey, I've noticed this thing that seems cool. I think we need to be doing more of it. There's many ways that it could look, but it might be part of the answer to the sort of the anxiety and frustration that you're feeling and the sort of powerlessness that you don't really have agency to change stuff in your community. Well, maybe if we could give you a bit of a different culture with a bit of a different structure, actually, you might be able to play quite a consequential role. So it's a little bit of, hey, maybe we've got this. Hey, maybe lots of things might get worse before they get better. I think we've still got lots of, rough waters ahead. But rough waters, I know this from being a coach, most people don't change their lives from inspiration. In my experience, most people change their lives from pain, right? From sort of like, gosh, this thing is really not working for me. Something's breaking down in my life. And that invites people to sort of open up a deeper inquiry about who they are now, what their self needs, maybe parts of themselves they have not included that need to come forward. And I think there's going to be a similar opportunity for us collectively where lots of things are breaking down and that's disorienting and we're moving apart from each other. But there is going to be a time, whether it's in the coming years or the coming decade, where we're going to have a lot of stuff, not just to rebuild it back, but to actually build it different and design it different. And that's sort of the thing that I myself want to be turned on to. I have been more turned on to, and I kind of want to invite other people to be more turned on to, because it's almost a place that you can use all these skills that you've maybe learned in your dating and relating and coaching and therapy, and to actually use them, not just for the benefit of yourself, but for the benefit of your community. Robbie's in Pennsylvania, Carrie's in New York. Robbie, so glad I got to see you on a live. Yeah, thanks for being here. Let me know, is any of this making sense? And I'm sort of laying a few things down. Let me know also if you've got a question. I love your questions. They're very energizing for me. So help me out. Chuck me a bone. Or if anyone wants to come on and chat with me live, if I can figure out the tech of that, I'm open to doing that as well. So let me know if you're picking up what I'm putting down. If you've just joined us, we are here talking about the hidden opportunity of our time. I'm basically saying there's an opportunity for all of us to be more empowered in the way that we're involved in the decisions that shape our lives, and sort of reimagining some of the system of how we make decisions, using things like citizens' assemblies or kind of community forums where we all have more voice. And I'm also talking about the way of being in conversation and relationship with other people, where we're from dating through to civic life, through to family life, through to work life, through to any place that you relate with other people. How can we get you understanding across difference more so that you have more ease and acceptance and relationship and connection, right? Most of us, I always say this, because I talk a lot about connection and intimacy, and I also find it hard. Right. So I don't talk from the place of like, oh, I've got all this down all the time. It's like, no, sometimes I struggle to reveal what's true for me. Or sometimes I struggle if I'm having a very different experience from someone else to sort of say, oh gosh, I'm actually having a very different experience from you. But I like to say about myself, and I think it's true for most of us, if more connection and intimacy is on the menu of available options, I think most people want it. So even when I'm talking to people that say, I go spend time with my friends or families and no one wants to connect deeply with me, right? And I can know that experience. Like, gosh, can't we deepen this? We're sort of chit-chatting about sports or politicians you've never met, and it's all a bit third person. And actually, ask me a real question, or maybe I'm trying to ask someone else a real question and they're sort of slightly resisting going a bit deeper, seems to me. And I've learned over time that it's better if I can lead with vulnerability and reveal things rather than sort of using my questions to invite that from someone else when perhaps I'm not really modeling it myself. But that's also sometimes an edge. But I think most people, if intimacy is available, right, to have a more connected, more present, more intimate, aware conversation, I think most people want that. What's your experience? Does that seem true to you? If it's true that we are in this epidemic of loneliness and disconnection, what are we going to do about that? How do we create spaces and norms where that's less the case? And I know that online spaces are often taking attention away from in-person spaces. I also do think there's ways of using online to have a deep connection with people. It's just about how those spaces kind of get set up. So Eunice, tuning in from California, welcome. Curious how the weather's this time of year in California. They're here on the East Coast, Mid-Atlantic. It's beautiful. It's still pretty hot. We're going to be 29 Celsius this weekend. I'm slightly illiterate in Fahrenheit. Basically, I have to do the actual literal math in my head, which is, it's good in some ways, but it's bad in others. So let me do the math. So if it was 30 degrees, that would be divided by 5 is 6 times by 8 is 48. Add 32 makes 80 Fahrenheit. So I think that's pretty hot for coming into mid-fall, which is also my favorite season. And you might have seen a few messages from me recently. I think fall is a really powerful time to do inner work, right? Whether that's in a coaching context, in a self-development context, whatever the context is that's right for you, because this is a time of letting go, right? So if you think about releasing old narratives of self or ways of being that are no longer serving you, I think fall can be a really powerful time to have that kind of release, because that's basically what's happening in the natural world, right? As things are being let go, leaves are going to be falling, the old is being cleared away, and the new will be getting ready for the new year and the new spring. Hey to Brandy, tuning in from Washington State. Appreciate this. Got good turnout from the West Coast. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here. If you're here live, please leave me a question, comment. Let me know if what I'm saying is making sense to you. If you're here after the event, please also feel free to leave a comment. I will read all of them. We're talking about the hidden opportunity of our time. And I'm saying that opportunity is to relate better with people who think and feel differently to you, to give people a right to their lived experience that is different than your lived experience, and to give people a right to have their perspectives. We've obviously in the last 48 hours, here in the US, but I know that's dominated global headlines. We've had an act of abhorrent violence, and obviously that's not okay, and that's not the way that we want to proceed with one another. And I also think it's symptomatic of times where we are struggling to find one another. And part of that struggling to find one another is that we legitimately are living in different worldviews, and we've got to learn how to relate with people that have a different worldview to us. And I think people have a right to their worldview. And one of the reasons I believe people have a right to their worldview is because I think it's the only developmentally sober way of looking at things. Sort of meaning you can reject someone's worldview, but that doesn't change anything about their worldview, right? Generally, this is true in coaching, and I think it's also true in life. If you want to help someone change, part of it is you're going to make invitations to try something on, to experiment with a new way of being. So if you genuinely think this person's worldview is problematic, or this person's worldview, I actually think my worldview is better, right? Again, I've talked earlier about it's worth having humility about how much we really know about our own worldview, right? Meaning I believe there's probably going to be worldviews beyond my own, right? Whether they're available to me in this lifetime or they're just available to people in 50 years time that have more consciousness than was available to me in this life. But if someone has a right to their worldview, it takes us out of this sort of superior, inferior. It takes it out of, well, you must be dumb or stupid or cruel or moral. And it sort of invites in like, let me actually get curious about the person who's in front of me. Because sometimes what it is they're inhabiting a worldview that might be parts of which you benefit from learning how to include in your worldview, right? So in a simple way, one of the big issues in the culture wars is that people with more progressive values and people with more traditional values, people with more progressive values and worldview and people with more traditional values and worldview, they don't like each other and they don't understand each other. And they're very quick to label each other as immoral and stupid. And, there's plenty of people smarter than me, but I'm not the dumbest guy. And I think it's generally served me to imagine that I don't really know how smart I am in certain ways, right? Because there's always going to be people that see more and know more and that can add to my worldview. So there's sort of a little bit of a hubris that I think I historically occupied to think, well, yeah, my worldview is just a better worldview than this one. And these people, and then it's very easy to project, right? These people don't care. These people, they don't even know about the issues. Fill in the blanks with the way that you might have talked about other people or that you hear other people talk about people. It's much harder to do that if you actually have to get into personal relationship with someone and your job is to get curious about their worldview and what they're valuing, because that turns you into curiosity, right? And we know this when we're in judgment, generally we kind of shut it down. And when we're in curiosity, we generally kind of open it up. And being in curiosity versus judgment, it's not just good for the other, it's good for self, right? Because I might learn something here. Or I might understand, oh, there's something that they value, which is not the thing I want to orient my life around, but actually, God, yeah, maybe I have been a bit disconnected from tradition, right? Or maybe there isn't really a place so much for honor and discipline in my life. Or maybe I have gotten into this very universal worldview where I sort of have love and respect for everyone, but I've perhaps gone a little bit away from particularly reinforcing like my roots or my hometown or my family or people who grew up in the way that I grew up. And actually reconnecting with that and revaluing it more is actually good for me. Right. So there's, I think, ways that opening up to other people can be good for them. Right. And from my perspective, actual violence is always likely to follow if there is a level of demonizing rhetoric and othering to the point where people's basic humanity is no longer on the table. Right. So yes, I appreciate that most political leaders have come out in the last 24, 48 hours and said, we condemn this assassination. There's no place for this in politics. There's also a sober part of me that says, if that's a real claim that you want to make to people, then we all need to be much more responsible for how we dial that rhetoric down. And I don't think you can dial it down without some genuine effort to say, hey, there might be something I don't know here. That might be something I need to understand. There might be something I need to actually get closer to rather than further away from. The further away I get from it, the more likely I am to kind of judge it and not really understand it. Maybe the closer I can get to it, the more it might have something for me that it teaches me, right? And I spent a lot of time studying in the integral community, the integral world, and one of the basic claims of integral development, integral theory is to try to transcend and include as many worldviews as you can, and that no one is 100% wrong and no one is 100% right. And that just simple maxim that I or no one else are 100% right or 100% wrong. There's always something I can learn. There's always a partial truth, or there's a subcommunication, or there's a thing that this person values, even if the policy recommendation is kind of wonky. Staying in that level of awareness has been powerful for me. I spent a lot of time in my 20s going to all sorts of personal growth. And a lot of it I found really hard because I think just with people who are in a different worldview. So what I sort of took as personal development and they took as personal development were two pretty different things. And so I'd go to a lot of seminars and it would be like, I don't like this brand of evangelism, right? Or I don't like the way that they are forcing people to strive when actually I think it's maybe about helping people be a bit more real and authentic. And that striving, it can improve you, but it can bash you over the head so much. Your striving seems to be rooted in the inner critic. And that's difficult for me. I don't think that's the place that real development comes from. And then getting more familiar with the integral literature. And you don't have to read all the literature. You can come hang out here a little bit and just some of these precepts, like no one's 100% right, no one 100% wrong, I think can start to shape a way of being in the world that invites you into more connection and more relationship with more people. And I actually think getting out of a bit of a groupthink bubble of being in, let's say, a progressive culture where everyone thinks progressively, there's something very nice and connecting about that. But then it's pretty polarizing with people who aren't in that worldview. And it can lead to a kind of othering of a whole set of people that aren't in your worldview, as if they just sort of need to come up to speed to you. And I didn't like being in the world in that way. rejecting other people, challenging their sense of smarts or morality. Now, it's not to say that all arguments are created equal. It's not to say that in the marketplace of ideas, you can't passionately pitch for what you want to pitch for. I think we get better from that. But if you can combine that with a little bit of opening and curiosity and humility and actually, what is this person valuing? Because nearly everyone is valuing something all the time. I know I've been surprised when I've read accounts of incarcerated people. I haven't been incarcerated. I have been in a prison before, and talked to a prison governor and tried to learn a little bit about it. In prison, there's lots of codes about how you behave, right? Which is in any other way of talking, there's a moral code, right? There's a moral code about who the worst offenders are. There's a moral code about how you engage with the authorities. And there's probably all sorts of codes that I don't have any idea about at all, right? So bear in mind, my experience of this is limited. That's sort of interesting to me because you can imagine, well, if someone's pick your worst crime, someone's a murderer, if someone's a rapist, if someone's a serial burglar, it'd be easy just to think, well, that person's immoral, right? But actually, that's a simplistic worldview. It might be convenient, it might be comforting to be in that worldview, right? That person all bad, me over here all good. But if you look at Jung or anyone that's talking about the psyche, the shadow, how to include parts of ourselves that we tend to reject, it's not quite so convenient just to think that it's all wrong over there and it's all right over here, right? Joseph Campbell said all the heavens and all the hells are within me. I'm paraphrasing. And that's an interesting perspective to be in, where it's like, actually, yeah, okay, maybe this person on their worst day did something that's absolutely abhorrent, and rightfully we say as a society we condemn that, we punish it, and we incapacitate you. But that doesn't mean that you haven't got people in your life that you might be incredibly, supportive of, good to. It's always that question of who's on the inside and who's on the outside of someone's circle of concern. And generally, if someone's inside someone's circle of concern, their behavior towards those people, generally speaking, is probably pretty good, certainly versus their behavior to who falls outside in the out group and outside their circle of concern. All righty. If you're just joining us, thank you for being here. If you've been here throughout, thank you for being here. I will take questions or comments. Let me just see if I can throw this up on the screen. Curious to know your thoughts on how to maintain personal energy while engaging in spaces that have strongly entrenched cultures. Yeah, that's a good question. I am someone who is energetically sensitive, and I, in some ways, feel like I've been dealing with this, from having lived a life in Boulder, Colorado, which is, at least in the sub-communities I was in, was sort of a certain culture, lots of openness to coaching and healing and inner work. That was sort of the essence of the conversation. And then moving into the DC area, which is much more of a work-focused, sort of work persona identified, credentialism kind of culture, like who did you work for? Who do you know? Where did you go to school? And I had been outside of that way of being for quite a long time. I'm sort of like, yeah, it doesn't really bother me. I don't really care where you went to school. I really just want to relate with you. But here, evidently, people pay a lot more attention to that. So I still think I'm learning some stuff about this. One of my invitations, in a way, that, as I was talking about earlier, is I think we might need to create some new ways of being, some new cultures. So one of the things that you might consider is there some kind of stand for cultural container that you can take and invite people into it? That, hey, in this space, actually, we are going to engage in active listening, right? And in this space, we're practicing curiosity, not judgment. In this space, we value connection over being right. In this space, we imagine people have a right to their lived experience, and we're not going to tell people what their lived experience is or that it's wrong. I think one of the things that helps maintain personal energy is staying connected to yourself, right? So in some spaces, you might need a little bit more boundary around yourself, or noticing if there's a tendency to kind of get over there with the group. One of the things that I found useful to tell myself is, I am sensitive, so I get impacted. Sometimes I don't like that because I get impacted in ways that I would maybe choose not to be impacted. But it's also kind of a gift to be impacted. And sometimes it's okay to be impacted in ways that I don't like. You know what I mean? It's like, I also don't like feeling super tired, but that sometimes is part of life. So maybe it's okay, because part of that impact is it's my empath in a way is actually getting to feel perhaps what is the dominant energy way of being in this group. And if I'm, let's say, I tighten about that, or I feel stressed about it, I'm probably picking up something that's important information in the group. There was a time in my life, I don't know if this is relevant to your inquiry, but I'll throw it out there in case it is, where I think I took the burdens of the world a bit more seriously. Sort of like, wow, I've been given a lot of, opportunity and privilege in my own life, and I want to make sure I make good on that. And I want to, sort of try to change the world and make a dent in a meaningful way. And then I think at some point I let that go as an idealized self-vision, and just sort of to trust that as I navigate my way through life, I will have the impact that I have. And it may be small, it may be bigger, it may be different on different days, and to sort of make that okay. So just noticing what role do I take on in the group, or in a culture that's difficult, Now, one of the benefits I have had is I did spend a lot of time in that Boulder culture, which was pretty helpful for me to get connected to myself and have people curious about my experience, and not be so sort of go on the work front. So sometimes it can be useful in development. It's a bit like sort of going on retreat, to spend times in immersive cultures that are doing more of the thing that you want to do, because that is fortifying. So you could also think about it that way. If you live in a place that, I'll just use this example because I'm running with it, that sort of more Boulderish way of being, that's a bit more touchy-feely and a bit more spiritually open and granola, as some people say, or it's got kind of some hippie culture in the background there. If you're in a culture that's very far from that, then it's also being sober about, well, how much can you kind of move that culture, in what sort of timeline? And maybe you need to go get sourced in cultures that support you to sort of be yourself. Or for me, sometimes that sourcing might just be getting back into my own energy field and spending enough time in my own energy that's replenishing, or, spending time in big nature or by water, or the things that tend to be restoring to me. But I'm curious about your experience or other people's experience. I think that's a really good question, because in a way I'm saying, hey, we need to reimagine our civic culture. And a lot of that is going to be going up against strongly entrenched cultures. I sort of have an intuition that if people knew what it was like to be in a civic space where they felt more heard and seen, more actively listened to, and therefore could maybe let their walls down a little bit against other people's perspectives that were different, I think they would want that option. I don't currently think there's a ton of those spaces, but I think they're starting to emerge. So maybe this, at least in a civic sense, might start to get easier through time. Let me throw up, there's a follow-up question here. And let me know how that's landing. I'm curious if that's making sense. How can one remain open without letting the established culture trigger old wounds and programming? Yeah. So one perspective on getting triggered, which is about my least favorite experience, if I'm honest, but it's good for me. So that's the kind of paradox of being triggered. Not being triggered to the point that you're kind of overwhelmed, but the trigger lets me know, like, okay, yeah, there's still work here, right? There's still a wound, to use your language, or there's still a place that I kind of get hooked in, or I get activated. So at my best, I try not to resist my triggers, but that can sometimes be difficult, because I can definitely find myself in the, why is this happening? Or I don't want this to be happening, or can't I just get to enjoy my day or my evening, or hasn't this week already been hard enough? I don't really feel like I need another thing. But sometimes it's just good for me to try to just be with my experience and acknowledge, yeah, this is kind of rough. It's hard. I'm struggling. Yeah, I'm just trying to connect again to the essence of this. How to remain open without letting the established culture trigger old wounds and programs. So part of that is, what is your rapport with the established culture? Kind of meaning, the less rejecting your orientation to the established culture, the more it's probably easy to be with, right? Maybe that's self-evident. But it's a little bit like, in some cultures they say, very much you've got to make sure that you honor your mother and your father, your parents. Now, that doesn't mean you need to live the life that they've lived. Doesn't mean you need to be in the same way of being, same culture. But it sort of starts with that kind of respect. So the established culture, again, if there's a specific example, let me know what it is. But if I just say, okay, established Western culture, right? There's lots of things that we can try to improve about that, right? Whether that's from a equity and fairness perspective, distribution of wealth, the fact that lots of people are struggling to make a living, loneliness, disease of despair. We've got many issues, right? I don't need to point that out to any of you. At the same time, there's lots of things that the West, I think, has done pretty well, right? That, many of the countries in the West are pretty stable. The vast majority of people get education. The vast majority of people can feed and clothe themselves. There's, generally speaking, low levels of corruption in government when you compare it to history. There's probably not that many times of history that you'd prefer to have been alive. Even the 1800s, life expectancy for most people, pretty abysmal. Mothers dying in childbirth happening all the time. Kids making it to adulthood, kind of a success story. Many wouldn't. Many kids would die by the age of 5. So not just trying to be down, but saying, oh, we've actually achieved a lot, culturally, in medicine, in democracy, in law, in many of these fields. And of course, ways to go, open-ended cycle of improvement. But that's part, I think, of honoring the establishing cultures that you can notice, rather than it sort of being like, oh, the West is a sort of just a toxic thing, which I think some people can be in that perspective. It's like, well, hang on a minute. Even the fact that you get to say that and no one's really going to come after you most of the time, that is sort of an achievement. And a lot of history, that wouldn't have been the case. And the fact that you care so much about this thing called democracy, that's an achievement in history. The fact that you got to finish high school and most of that was paid by the community, and the fact that you got to go to college, or at least had a shot at that. All of these things are kind of historically anomalous for the vast majority of people. So I think there's something about that, right? Or let's say the established culture is corporate America, right? And we can say corporate America has issues of, the CEO to worker pay ratio is crazy. Everything's about shareholder value, and we're kind of pillaging the planet. There's lots of kind of toxic masculinity in sales culture and expectations. People aren't even getting 2 weeks off a year. This is kind of unhealthy. So there's lots of things, and you don't need to be in those perspectives. But I'm shooting from my hip of things that you might say people would complain about corporate culture. But then at the same time, we've got to say, wow, there are these massive corporations and, tons of small and medium-sized businesses that have just delivered a ton of products and services in pretty reliable ways to all sorts of people with things that, look, I've got my iPhone here. I have pretty much zero idea how you actually create this kind of iPhone. Like, okay, maybe you've got some Gorilla Glass and you have some kind of supply chain to India or Taiwan. And okay, we've got 12 megapixel cameras, but what do I really know about the software and the hardware of an iPhone? Little to none, honestly. So there's something about acknowledging that even when you think, well, this world is effed up and it's getting worse, or no one cares, or it's sort of having the sobriety to notice, oh, wow, there probably isn't another time that you would necessarily want to change this for. Now, some people say they would rather have lived in 1920s, and, every year I'm sure has some things that are really redeeming about it. But just sort of in gross orienting generalization, we are, generally speaking, probably the most educated, probably the wealthiest, probably the safest, although I think that has taken a bit of a backslide in maybe the recent decade. So there's lots of things to be grateful for, right? Like there's lots of things in my life that I don't make happen. I did not build my car. I did not create the iPhone. I don't really know how this microphone actually does what it does. I get to talk to you on YouTube. I don't really know how that works, et cetera, et cetera. I breathe air with lungs that I didn't create, that were given to me. So that might sound a little bit metaphysical for some of you, but it's just sort of saying, okay, look at the thing, warts and all, have your critique, but see what's good about it and be in rapport with what's good about it, because then you don't need to reject it. When you're not rejecting it, it's then easier to be an invitation to other people to say, hey, actually, there's this other thing that's kind of cool, rather than like, oh, you are bad, you're gross, you're wrong, and I'm sort of shunning you. And even if I'm not saying it, you can probably feel it energetically. And then I think, when you are triggered, try to own it, try to take some time to slow it down. Titrate, sort of meaning you might not be able to be in an established culture for as much time as you would be if you didn't have that wound. So yeah, maybe you can show up for an event, but just for an hour and not 3 hours. And that's actually okay. That's sort of doing your bit. So, sort of balancing your self-care needs. In some ways, it's an orientation to your own sensitivities, right? So for a lot of my life, I had, and maybe to some extent still have, gluten sensitivity. I can sort of try to concretize my identity around my gluten sensitivity. Or I could say, well, actually, my life would be easier if it's true and available that I desensitize, and then I can have more options on my menu. And that might not be available, right? You might be fully celiac and that's just not available to you. But maybe it's available to some of us, or maybe the tolerance can change or the sensitivity can shift over time. So that's probably the same thing that you would want with a wound or sort of old programming, that you actually just get to be with it with a little bit more skillfulness, a little bit more ease. Basically, what we call FSA, full self-acceptance, and full self-acceptance comes normally from rapport, from actually being in relationship with something. Doesn't mean you have to like it all, but you start to judge the things you don't like less, so even the experience called I don't like this maybe isn't quite as sort of viscerally rejecting. Appreciate the line of inquiry. I'm curious if that's making sense. Curious to know of any practices that facilitate openness of heart and mind while maintaining internal strength. Yeah. Well, I think generally open-mindedness is supported by presence. So anything that supports presence, which could be meditation or yoga, could be sensory experience in nature, could be body work. I know that when I have a massage, there's just a kind of somatic awareness that it's very hard for me to sort of arrive at with my current life and practices. So that stuff's all good. I think, a good way to open your heart is to be talking to people. I was just in a cafe earlier, and you got, I guess it was the sort of like the grandmom, the father, the little kid, and then I'm not quite sure what the relationship was, but let's say a family friend. And there was no real space to sit. I'd gone there to do some work, but the cafe was like busier than I've ever seen it. Not sure why. I was talking to the people working there, and they're like, we're not even sure why. It's just a Friday late morning where everyone wants to be here. So, okay, that's cool. And the guy's like, look, I realize it's a bit unconventional because he's like, got a baby, but he's like, if you want to join us and sit here, come join us. And we ended up getting into a nice conversation, and we disagreed about a lot of things, but we agreed about some stuff, but it was kind of open and civil, but also passionate. And that's a pretty neat opportunity. So I think any time that I'll own it myself, that I'm sort of relating with people and trying to reveal what's true for me and get what's true for them, I think that facilitates openness of heart. I know some people get value from doing heart meditations, kind of heart mantras. I would say in my own life, I've probably gotten most value from actually the direct practice of being with people. And I've also had experience where we can't find each other enough, and it's kind of, in a way, closing my heart, right? Because there's not the sense of psychological or emotional safety, or one or both of us are triggered, or it's kind of reactive. So I think there are also limits to this. I'm not saying, just sort of open your heart to relate where it's actually you're not feeling sort of basic sense of safety. But where that is in place, or where you can kind of work on the edges of that, I think getting into whatever kind of relationships, but just getting into relationship with people. Very interested to know how to engage in the cultural transformation you're talking about. Yeah, I am. Look, my job is just to paint the broad horizons, and then I need people who are actually good at kind of making this stuff happen, helping make it happen. I think part of my job is, opening people up in the best way, provoking the idea that, hey, maybe the way we're doing business, actually, we can make some improvements to that. And also to bring attention to the kind of the early shoots that I or any of us see, So, for instance, in the UK right now, there's an organization called Time to Assemble, and they have been helping catalyze assemblies in local communities. They even have some money that they give. I think it's like 150 pounds if you undertake to run an assembly in your community, which is really sort of getting people together for an evening for a couple of hours and breaking people out in small group conversations, having someone that facilitates it, having some ground rules that are mostly around, hearing people, safety, no one dominating the conversation, everyone's voice is valuable, and then trying to sort of synthesize that input so a community can say, hey, these are our top 5 priorities, something like that. So I see that in a very, kind of cost effective, not too high barrier to entry way. That's getting rolled out. Citizen assemblies are happening in the US. Sometimes they're commissioned by government, so they're more official. For instance, the one I'm going to in Boulder has been commissioned by Boulder City and Boulder County. And, so they put the funds in to, they do a big mail shot. They invite people to sort of opt in. They try to make sure that it's very demographically representative across age and income, race, gender, sexuality, geography, education levels. So you're basically trying to get a real, what we call kind of micro public. If you think of the sort of macro republic, this is a micro republic or micro public. It's the small microcosm that recommends the macrocosm. And then normally there's some kind of specific question that they're asking you, like, it could be a land use thing. So, for instance, in Fort Collins in Colorado, the CSU, Colorado State University Rams, the football team, they had an out of town or on the edge of town sports stadium. They ended up buying land and building a new stadium in town, and that site was up for grabs. The city bought it and then went to the people and said, hey, how do you want to use this land? And there's all sorts of proposals, from dog parks to bike trails to rewilding, but they got the city together in a conversation. So there's some of these things that are a little bit more kind of formal, commissioned. I'm a fan of that. I'm also really a fan of the bottom-up grassroots. Hey, we just want to have this conversation in our neighborhood. We've noticed there's an issue in our neighborhood with X, and we are going to convene a conversation about it, and everyone's welcome. And it's happening, 2 weeks from now. And cool if this organization can help us even with a little bit of money to do the space, but you might not even need that. There might be a community space that would make itself available for that. So that's maybe a bit more of a formal, structured way, let's say, bringing people together around a conversation. But I also think it's just in how we relate to each other. Like if you are conservative, my challenge to you would say, hey, could you, in this season, could you bring 3 liberals into your life and befriend them? Doesn't mean you need to agree on even anything, really, just that we're going to try to be in the same space. Now, you might not become as tight as your friends that really share your worldview, because there is something, and probably an intimate relationship is going to be easier to be in relationship with someone that really has your worldview. But that's, for most people, that's one relationship, or if you're polyamorous, maybe it's a few relationships. But we're talking about the whole breadth of relationships in your life, or if you're incredibly progressive and leftist, what would it be like for you to try to actually reach out and open your heart to someone who currently you think is kind of the enemy? And maybe you have even good experience at the enemy. Maybe you've been in very contentious lived experience. But there is a thing, for instance, a friend of mine has been part of putting together, it's called Similarity Hub. You can Google that. And what it gives you is a whole set of policy positions that most people agree on. And by most people, we normally mean 60 or 70% plus of people. And these across all areas, from the difficult stuff, gun control, immigration, to, national economy, to climate, all of it, that basically there are positions that a majority of people can get behind. Doesn't mean to say you like it as much as your own position, but often in politics, it's what can you minimally agree to, not what do you maximally want. So that can be a good sort of fortifying resource to say, oh gosh, 70% of people could get behind this, 77 people get behind that. Now that's a US focused thing, but I'm sure that same principle could be carried across to most countries, even if I don't know the specific resources that are on the ground. If you just joined us, thank you for being here. I am taking questions and comments, so please leave them. If you're joining after the event, thank you also for being here. I appreciate that. I will intend to be live much more across the season. I am going to be in Colorado soon, and I'm intending to do a live collaboration with Clayton Olson. I know some of you have been asking for us to get back on together, so if we can do that live, we shall. And I'm going to get to the last few comments here, and we'll start thinking about wrapping this up. So Robbie says, great questions, Kiki. I appreciate the appreciation of the questions. He says, yes, that makes sense. Love the point about looking for cultures and identifying practices and places that source my energy. Love the point about building rapport with the positive. Yes. Yeah, would love to know if any of you do practice this, what you find with it. So I'm actually curious if you're making any of the connections that I'm making, that some of the stuff that could be useful in dating and intimate relationship could also be useful in workplace, family, and sort of civic relationships. That generally we're better when we're curious and not judgmental. Generally, we do better when we care about connection and not just being right. Generally, we're better when we don't try and impose our values and worldviews on other people, right? Even if in dating, you might say, well, I want to choose for someone, select for someone that has a broadly similar worldview or even a very specifically similar worldview, because that might be easier for us to be sort of on the same page, see the world the same way, have less kind of natural resistance to one another. And you will probably find this, that in dating, you often meet people who aren't a good fit or aren't a perfect fit. Right. And so a lot of that can be, well, okay, if we're going to be here and have this drink or walk or dinner or whatever we're doing, how can I actually be in maximum acceptance of the person opposite me? Right. Now, I know that can be difficult in dating because part of you is sort of running the analysis, like, is this person, do I want another date? Is it a good person we should relate with? But if you can just put that down, often that analysis can be there after the event, right? You can sort of go home and just sort of sit with it. Or, maybe it's obvious to you even in the first 10 minutes, I don't necessarily want to see this person again, or maybe I do, right? But it's trying to say, I've worked with a lot of people who, in a way, the summary of their issue is no one is quite good enough for them. Like no one is really measuring up in dating, right? Now, that might be a sort of a structural dating issue that, you're in a small dating pool and, you're into these specific interests and no one actually shares them, or you have this way of being and values that no one shares, right? So you might need to sort of widen up the pool. But if we just put the structural factors to the side, what if you approach your dating more from the place of, how can I accept and kind of love on, right? Not having to physically demonstrate any love, but just be in a loving or open orientation towards the person in front of me. Because sometimes for that person where no one really measures up, that is actually the thing that your dating is there to teach you, is actually how to open up to people, right? And not just sort of step back and be in judgment of, oh, he's too this, he's too that. Oh, he's not fit enough. Oh, he doesn't take good care of himself. That may be true or maybe partially true, but what is keeping you in that more judgmental orientation? And what about that judgmental orientation could possibly be to do with keeping you safe, right? Because it's sort of safe to be stepped back and in judgment, but it's actually difficult to be in relationship. It's difficult to be in contact with the other. It's difficult to have some things you like about someone and some things you don't really like about them. But you can use your dating for your wakefulness, right? Or, to use Kiki's words, like, how do you keep that open heart? Well, dating is one place that you can practice that. If you notice that no one measures up, that can be the entry point for your curiosity about, is there anything here that is actually a me issue and not a them issue, right? It's very easy to be in a them issue, right? People aren't this, people aren't that, men aren't this, women aren't that. And again, these might be partially true or they might be grossly true. But where's the you in that? I was not a dating conversation. I had a conversation recently with someone where I kept trying to get them to focus on what their political experience was like. So when they were thinking about some of the issues in the country at large, what was actually coming up for them? And every time I'd ask them that, they would start with, well, people think this, or people think that, or people are stupid, or people are uneducated. And I was trying to really get them to distinguish, okay, so you're over there because you're telling me about people, but I'm asking you about you. And you don't have to answer that. It's a free country. But that's the question I'm asking. And I want to make sure you've distinguished and understood that. I'm actually wanting to know, what's your experience, right? So again, this can come up when I've helped people who are approaching their dating. I'm hearing a lot about men, right? And look, I'm not here to defend all men or to say that men are showing up great in dating. I think there's lots of improvement, and it's on both sides of the fence, or whoever you date, right? It's improvement all the way around. But I'm not here to defend, sort of bad dating cultural practices. We can all learn as men how to do better with that. But I'm here to say, for your transformation and your development, there needs to be some awareness over here with you. Like, what am I bringing, or where am I closed, right? Or to use that Rumi phrase, how do I remove the blocks to love? Because for most of us, and what I understand about when people end their lives, that's what they seem to care about, right? It's how do I give the full measure of my love? I've still got a lot to learn about that. Maybe you do too. But I think the more that and I'll just own it for myself, the more that I am able to not write anyone off or to not substitute someone's limitation for being disconnected from my actual experience. Sure, we're all limited, and maybe you're quick to see the limitations in other people. Maybe that's your gift. Maybe you're pretty intuitive like that, or you're just perceptive, you're aware, you've been with enough people. But that's a different thing than noticing, oh, where am I able to stay in my acceptance? Where am I able to keep my loving heart open? What is actually going on for me? Where am I in a perspective that this is hopeless or that I'm powerless, or like what is actually coming up? And sometimes that stuff is icky and difficult, and it takes courage to be with. But in the same way that I think we benefit from being in that, with that in our dating, I think we benefit from being or relating, or whatever stage of relationship you're at. I think we benefit from being in it when we're having a more political conversation with someone, like, oh, what is actually, where am I in this? So I can talk third person about, we should do this, we should do that, homeless this, climate policy that. And some of those perspectives might be amazingly powerful perspectives. I'm just distinguishing that's slightly different than where's my vulnerability in the political process, or where's the place that I feel tight or afraid or stingy, or like I don't really want to make concessions, or I'm rigid, because that's the place of our own wakefulness and transformation. And in doing that, I think we're offering something and modeling something to the collective, which is deeply needed right now, in my perception. Happy to be wrong about that, but that's what's been coming up for me for a while. So if there's any more from any more, let me know. If you're here in real time, thank you so much for being here and sharing your evening with me. If you've come after the event, thank you so much for taking the time to come this far in the event. I hope you've got some value. Give me your feedback, because I want to be talking more. I am going to be mixing some of these themes of different types of relating with people, including our kind of collective and civic relationships, because that just seems like it's bubbling up in me. It seems like it's kind of needed, but you let me know if it's not what you want me to talk about. But it means I will be trying to migrate into some new directions here with my content. But that's alive for me, but I also want it to be alive for other people as well. So if it has been alive for you, thank you. As always, open to your feedback and comment. And yeah, I'm Jack. Thanks for being here. I'll be with you again soon. Bye.